Hello and welcome to this video on breathing space regulations. Before I begin, let me give you a quick introduction to myself so you can see how I can help you. I'm Sharon Mashan. I work with Steve. He's my husband and business partner. We started investing in property in the early 2000s, and around 2011, as a result of Steve taking voluntary redundancy, we went on to do some professional property training, and that really kick-started our property investing journey. We quickly built our own portfolio. We attracted a joint venture partner to purchase even more property, and from that we created our own property management company to manage the properties we were buying. This led us on to source properties, and we've helped investors based all over the world build their property portfolios too. We manage these properties for our clients, and nowadays we specialise in managing high-end HMOs across the Northwest. More recently, we've developed a training arm to our business called the Property Management Programme. Our mission is to provide the information and education property owners need to help avoid the many hazards we face in today's increasingly regulated industry, and to help you fulfil your dreams of becoming a successful property entrepreneur. Our Landlord's Ultimate How-To Guide is a standalone resource for fellow property investors who want to have the knowledge and confidence to manage their properties for themselves, or want to understand what their managing agent should be doing on their behalf. Today I'm going to talk about the new debt respite scheme, also known as breathing space regulations. These regulations were passed by the government in December of 2020, but they don't actually come into force until May of this year, that's 2021. The key things to bear in mind about this breathing space scheme is that people can only be entered into it through two routes. The first is a debt advice provider who's authorised to offer debt counselling by the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, or by a local authority where they provide debt advice to residents. The other thing to understand about these breathing space regulations is that there are two types. There's a standard breathing space and there's a mental health crisis breathing space. A standard breathing space is available to anyone with debt, and it gives them legal protection from creditor action for up to 60 days. And later on we'll see in a little bit more detail what this means. The second type of breathing space is for those suffering a mental health crisis, and this does need to be a crisis. It's not ongoing long-term mental health treatment. For those people in mental health crisis, the breathing space lasts as long as the crisis lasts, plus 30 days. For a debtor to be considered to be referred by their debt advisor, they need to be an individual, they need to have a qualifying debt to a creditor, and we'll look at qualifying debt a little bit later. Do bear in mind this only covers England and Wales, so if you're in Scotland or Northern Ireland, these regulations do not apply. People cannot enter a breathing space regulation if they already have a debt order relief or an IVA, or they're an undischarged bankrupt at the time that they apply. Going forwards, they can't have already had a breathing space within the last 12 months, and the advisor needs to deem that they're unlikely to be able to repay some or all of the debt for which the breathing space is being applied for. Also, the advisor has to make an assessment that the person applying for breathing space regulation is that this mechanism is actually appropriate and relevant for that person, and there aren't other more appropriate methods with which to help that person. The additional criteria for somebody to be entered into the mental health crisis breathing space is that they must be receiving mental health crisis treatment at the time the application is made. I'm not going to go into detail here, but on the government website there is a list of mental health practitioners that can put forward somebody for the mental health breathing space regulation. Now, the definition for breathing space is qualifying types of debt. So what does that mean? So what is included is unsecured debt. Examples are credit cards, store cards, personal loans, payday loans, overdrafts, utility bill arrears, and more relevant for landlords is rental arrears. Now, there are certain types of debt which can't be covered by breathing space. So, for example, if you have a secured debt, then you can't enter this breathing space regulation. Now, interestingly, guarantors are not directly covered. Therefore, if you have a tenant who's unable to pay their rent and the tenant enters a breathing space, but they have a guarantor in place, you're still allowed to pursue the guarantor under these regulations. Other types of debt that are excluded or not allowed to be considered for breathing space are debts incurred through fraud, fines for court offences, payment of child maintenance, any crisis loans that may already have been given. Interestingly, student loans are also excluded, and if you owe somebody money for personal injury damages, that's excluded, as is any advance that's been received through universal credit. Once a breathing space has been activated, the debt advisor will notify the insolvency service who manage the national database. Once somebody's entered on that database, they're deemed to be covered by the breathing space regulations. Part of the process that the person needs to go through in order to obtain breathing space is to provide details of all their debts to their debt advisor, and therefore their debt advisor will then contact all of the various different creditors. Once you've been contacted and informed that your debtor is within the breathing space regulations, you're not allowed to contact or visit the debtor to pursue the debt. You can't phone, email, text or anything with regards to the debt in terms of pursuing the debt, any interest or charges, or following up any previous communications in relation to the debt. If the person who owes you the money contacts you and asks you a question, you can answer the question, but that's all. In terms of rental properties, your duties as landlord for repair and maintenance are still in place. So let's say, for example, the tenant phoned you to say that there was a problem at the property. You still need to respond and deal with that maintenance issue, even if they're under this breathing space regulation. And when you see them, you're not allowed to speak to them about their debt. The other point to bear in mind is that during the 60-day period, you're not allowed to charge interest or fees for that period. And any fees that would be accrued during that period can never be recovered. You effectively have to write them off. If you've got any enforcement action in progress at the time that the breathing space is imposed, for example, you might have commissioned a debt collection agency to pursue any debt on your behalf, you need to stop that enforcement action and you need to notify that agency for them to stop their action too. You're not permitted to start any new enforcement actions at this time either. This means that you can't go to court to start bankruptcy proceedings, for example. Importantly, for the private rented sector, if someone is protected under breathing space regulations, you're not permitted to serve them a Section 8 notice for overdue rent, nor are you allowed to enforce a Section 8 notice that has perhaps already been approved, or regain possession through the bailiffs during this breathing space period. Somewhat reassuringly though, the ongoing rent is still due. This is not a payment holiday and the debt does need to be repaid at some point. Ongoing liabilities, so for example month-to-month rent, is still due. The breathing space only applies to specific static debt at a point in time. So if the rent is due within the breathing space timescales, that rent is still due. If the debtor does not continue with their ongoing payments during the breathing space time, then their breathing space for their existing debt can be cancelled. Now, this allowance doesn't apply to mental health breathing space. If someone is in the mental health crisis breathing space, you can't pursue them for anything, including ongoing liabilities at this time. Now, as I said, one of the reasons for cancelling the breathing space is that the debtor fails to meet ongoing obligations such as their rent payments. A breathing space regulations might be cancelled if they've agreed a solution with their creditors. For example, if they've agreed an IVA or some sort of repayment plan, then the breathing space will be cancelled. If the debtor has not engaged with their own debt advisors during the period, then this can also lead to cancellation of their breathing space. There's a midpoint review of part of the process, and if the debtor hasn't engaged by this point, the debt advisor can make the decision to withdraw the breathing space. Finally, you as a creditor can potentially request a review at this midpoint. For example, if you feel that the debtor has provided fraudulent information or has the funds to pay and just isn't paying, there are a few specific reasons why you can call a review. If your review is upheld, the breathing space can then be cancelled. If your review is not upheld, you can actually appeal this through further court action. So that's a brief summary of the breathing space regulations that will be coming into force from May this year. If you've got any questions on anything I've covered here, or any questions about property management issues generally, do feel free to drop me an email. If you want to keep up to date with the changing legislation, then why not check out our YouTube channel, PMP TV. I regularly post short videos on topics relevant to property management, and we cover the changing legislation such as this, and there is more in the pipeline for the year ahead, so do keep an eye out for that. We also have a group on Facebook called Investors Circular, which you're more than welcome to join, and of course I'm in LinkedIn as well. So as I say, if you've got any questions about the content of this presentation, or you want to find out more about our training resources to help you be better prepared to self-manage, then do get in touch.